Once upon a time, the medieval cartographers of Central Asia drew a plant that grew a living sheep out of its stalk. Not sheep-shaped fruit or a sheep-like leaf, a sheep, tethered to the ground by its own vine, grazing until it ran out of slack, and then dying. And the thing is, people believed it. For over 300 years, the Vegetable Lamb of Tartary appeared in serious natural history texts, alongside real animals and real plants, treated as completely credible. But it is far from the only plant and human mythology designed to make you deeply uncomfortable. That's what this episode is all about. Stories that shaped how people understood the natural world before science had the tools to push back. Oh, heads up. This is part 1, because there are genuinely enough mythical plants to fill several episodes, and I will absolutely be coming back for the rest. But for today, we're diving into 10 plants, some terrifying, some beautiful, some completely baffling, and at least one that made respected 19th century scientists argue in academic journals about whether it was real. Let's go.
Hey, Future Megan here. Just wanted to pop in for a second and say that I'm going to be covering plants that are in languages I am not fluent in, so I'm most likely going to butcher a lot of the pronunciations, and I'm sorry about that. What I'm going to do to make sure that you actually know the plant I'm talking about is I'm going to leave text on the side, so that way you can check and see what the actual pronunciation is if I butchered it, which I most likely did. Again, sorry about that. I did my best.
The Vegetable Lamb of Tartary, or the baromets from the Tartar word for lamb, was believed to be exactly what it sounds like, a plant that grew sheep. The legend has 2 versions. In the first, the plant produced pods that split open to release tiny living lambs. In the second, and somehow even more unsettling version, a single lamb sat on top of the stalk, tethered by an umbilical cord at its navel, bending down to graze in everything within reach. When it ate all the grass around it, the roots starved, and the whole thing died together. The myth traces back at least to the 5th century, with early mentions in some Jewish texts describing a creature called the Yedua, a lamb-shaped animal rooted to the earth by a stem at its navel. But it was the 14th century travelogue, The Travels of Sir John Mandeville, that spread it across Europe, describing a strange gourd-like fruit in Tartary that split open to reveal a lamb in flesh and blood. What Mandeville almost certainly didn't know was where the story actually came from. For a while, people believed the myth probably started as an attempt to explain cotton. Europeans had encountered this fiber from India and Central Asia without ever seeing how it was grown. They knew it was soft, they knew it came off a plant, they knew it looked kind of like wool. So the conclusion apparently was sheep plants. But in 1915, the scholar Berthold Laufer traced the origin and found it had nothing to do with cotton. It started with Pinna byssus, silk-like threads spun by a Mediterranean mollusk so fine and wool-like that Chinese annals described the cloth as coming from a shuiyang, meaning water sheep. That legend migrated over land through Arabic geographical texts, picked up Christian allegory in Syria, was transformed from a sea creature into a land animal sometime during the Mongol period, and arrived in Europe via Mandeville, already fully formed. 3 continents of trade route telephone ended with a sheep on a stalk. And that's when the vegetable lamb fever went viral, with collectors eagerly willing to pay for physical specimens. When Sir Richard Lee served as Elizabeth I's ambassador to Russia, Tsar Boris Godunov gifted him a cloak made from what were described as genuine Tartar lambskins. Lee bequeathed it to the Bodleian Library as, in his words, quote, a monument fit to go where the Tartar books are, and writs of this miracle. The Royal Society, bless their hearts, spent the better part of a century trying to work out what it actually was. Meanwhile, the philosophical community was fighting over whether the lamb could exist. In 1550, Italian polymath Girolamo Cardano dismissed it as a fable, but carefully, with 2 physiological arguments. First, plants only grow in one direction, while animal limbs grow dynamically. And second, crucially, quote, the soil is unsuitable for providing both pulsation and heat. The same year, Julius Caesar Scaliger fired back, and his goal was less to defend the lamb, more to embarrass Cardano. He described the plants, or lamb's flesh as tasting like crayfish, the blood as having a sweetness that was admirable, and the whole thing as, quote, fantastic, but not entirely improbable. He then challenged Cardano to explain, quote, how 4 distinct legs and their feet can be produced from one stem. But his point wasn't that the lamb was real, it was that Cardano's own understanding of plant physiology couldn't adequately rule it out. In 1618, Italian physician Fortunio Lichetti classified the lamb as a zoophyte, neither pure plant nor pure animal, formed by spontaneous generation, and concluded it, quote, shall not be counted among the fabulous. P.S. Who doesn't want to be counted among the fabulous? Francis Bacon in 1626 called it a fabulous narration and then spent a full paragraph explaining why the grass around it might be dead, reasoning the plant simply drew too much juice from the earth. He called the lamb a fable and then explained its biology anyway. It took the Tsar's own physician to finally say what everyone was dancing around. In 1664, Samuel Collins wrote to Robert Boyle from Moscow with the following assessment, quote, this is as true as the story of monocular people in Sir John Mandeville's travels, and such like fables which have not the least shadow of truth. The physical evidence came in 1698 when Hans Sloane presented a specimen to the Royal Society, a woolly rhizome from a Chinese tree fern, Cibodium barometz, sent from Madras. Sloane described it as, quote, shaped by art to imitate a lamb. The roots or climbing part is made to resemble the body, and the extant foot stalks as the legs. Botanist Johann Bruyne independently confirmed it shortly after, noting that one front leg had been artificially inserted, and the head, quote, very cleverly and neatly joined onto it. Carved fern roots ended up selling to credulous collectors across Europe, passed off as proof of a legend that began as sea silk, essentially misidentified as wool, somewhere in a Syrian trade route in the first millennium. The Ya-te-veo translates from Spanish as I see you, which is an unsettling name for a tree until you hear what it supposedly does with that vision. According to James W. Buell's 1887 book Sea and Land, the Ya-te-veo was a man-eating tree found in both Central Africa and Central America. It resembled, from a distance, a comfortable place to rest, a low, thick stump surrounded by long, trailing spines. But the moment you stepped inside the circle of these spines, they rose up. Buell described them as rising like gigantic serpents, entwining around the victim, drawing them onto the stump, driving thorns into the body. The plant then crushed the victim until, again, in Buell's words, every drop of blood is squeezed out and becomes absorbed by the gore-loving plant when the dry carcass is thrown out and the horrid trap set again. Buell presented this as traveler testimony without sources or even witnesses. He was just a popular science writer in an era when popular science writing had essentially no accountability and a mass audience hungry for stories about the terrifying unknown corners of the world would eat it up. No pun intended. What makes Ya-te-veo worth examining is the company it kept. Buell was writing into a fully developed hoax system. 13 years earlier, in April 1874, the New York World had run a front-page story by a reporter named Edmund Spencer describing a German botanist called Karl Leitch who had allegedly witnessed a Madagascan tribe called the Makotos sacrifice a woman to a carnivorous tree. Leitch described it as resembling a pineapple 8 feet high, dark brown and hard as iron, with 8 enormous leaves hanging to the ground from its apex like doors on hinges. At the top sat a concave white receptacle filled with what Leitch described as
clear, treacly liquid, honey sweet, and possessed of violent, intoxicating, and soporific properties.
Around the rim, long, hairy tendrils stretched out stiff as iron rods in every direction, and above those, 6 white translucent stalks twisted ceaselessly upward with a subtle, sinuous, silent throbbing against the air that Leitch later said made him shudder with their suggestion of serpent-flayed, yet dancing on their tails. When the Makotos men spotted the tree, they began shouting, "Tepe, tepe," and forced a woman at javelin point to climb it and drink from the liquid at the top. The moment she drank, the stalks seized around her neck and arms, strangling her as the tendrils grew tighter. The fluid running down the trunk mixed with the victim's blood. Makoto's men rushed towards it and drank it. Spencer called what followed a grotesque and indescribably hideous orgy. The story spread across newspapers and magazines for 14 years before an 1888 issue of Current Literature magazine exposed it as pure fiction. Carleche did not exist. The Makoto's tribe did not exist. The Karlsruhe Scientific Journal that the New York World claimed to have sourced the story from did not exist. Edmund Spencer had invented the entire thing from his desk. Buell published the Ya-te-veo 1 year before that exposure. He almost certainly knew the Madagascar story and almost certainly knew his audience believed it. The Ya-te-veo follows the same template: exotic location, traveler testimony, graphic depiction of the kill, but with a Spanish name and a new geography, giving it just enough distance from the Madagascar hoax to feel like an independent corroboration. Of course, none of it corroborated. Researchers who later searched for evidence of man-eating trees in both Madagascar and Central America found nothing. The locals, when asked, reportedly found the questions ridiculous. Also, the world of botany was changing. Actual carnivorous plants were being discovered and documented for the first time, like the Venus flytrap, which had been formally described in 1768. And if you want that full story, there's a whole History of Plants episode about it. The idea that a plant could eat an insect was newly real, and the so-called man-eating plants, like the Ya-te-veo, were relegated to the penny dreadfuls and pulp horror comics. It took over a century for these legends to find a proper champion in pop culture. And its name was Audrey 2.
Oh, it's starting to open. Isn't that smart? Oh, look, the first bud is open.
Pohun Upas is Javanese for poison tree, which turns out to be accurate. The legend built around it, not so much. This is one of the rare plants on this list that is actually real. Antiaris toxicaria grows across Southeast Asia and produces a latex so toxic it has been used as arrow poison for centuries. Hunters in Malaysia applied it to dart tips to bring down deer, boar, and monkeys. To give you an idea of its potency, when injected directly into the bloodstream, a single drop kills a dog in under 5 minutes. To be honest, I don't have the study and don't want to look it up that verifies that. Apparently, also 8 drops kills a horse. But what it doesn't do is kill everything within 15 miles of itself. That version of the story arrived in Europe via a 1783 article in London Magazine attributed to a Dutch surgeon named J.N. Forsch, who claimed to have visited Java and witnessed that tree firsthand. His account described a desolate valley where the upas grew alone. No other vegetation existed within 15 miles. No birds flew overhead. The streams nearby had no fish. The ground around the trunk was littered with the skeletons of men and animals. The poison, Foch wrote, could only be harvested by condemned criminals equipped with leather hoods fitted with glass eye holes and specific antidotes. Of those sent to collect it, the legend goes that maybe 1 in 10 returned. The account was almost certainly written not by Foch at all, but more likely by a London literary figure named George Stevens, who was known for fabricating colorful material and slipping it into print under other names. Foch may have existed. A Dutch surgeon did work in Java around that period, but the published account bears all the marks of Stevens' style and none of the marks of like a genuine observation. But it didn't matter. The story took off across European literary culture. Erasmus Darwin, physician, philosopher, poet, and grandfather of Charles, incorporated it into his 1789 poem, The Loves of the Plants. Lord Byron ran with it in Canto 4 of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, describing, quote, this boundless upas, this all-blasting tree, whose root is earth, whose leaves and branch be the skies, which rain their plagues on men like dew. In 1828, Russian poet Alexander Pushkin wrote an entire poem about it called Anchar, imagining a Tsar who sends a soldier to harvest the poison so he can tip his arrows with it to conquer neighboring peoples. Political cartoonists used the tree to represent Wall Street corruption. Temperance campaigners used it to represent alcohol. Quote, every person is like an upas tree that poisons the whole moral atmosphere about him. Preachers used it also to represent sin. The upas entered the English language as a metaphor for anything that poisoned everything around it, and stayed there for a better part of a century. Scientists were less enthusiastic. Specimens of Antiaris toxicaria were cultivated in British hothouses and botanical gardens, and the plants grew without incident, no surprise. No vapors or dead zones or skeletal surroundings. Researchers who traveled to Java found a tree that was genuinely toxic if its sap entered the bloodstream, but genuinely unremarkable if it didn't. The 15-mile death radius existed nowhere else except in that London magazine. Scientific American formally put the legend to rest in 1858, stating plainly that the story of fatal exhalations was now known to be false. Jubokko translates from Japanese as tree child and is considered yokai, a category of supernatural being in Japanese folklore that encompasses everything from benign spirits to outright monsters. Origin story is this. After a battle, the blood of the dead soaks into the earth. Trees whose roots drink deeply enough from this blood stop drawing nutrients from water and soil and are transformed. From that point, the only thing that sustains them is human blood, to the point that when a jubokko is cut open, it also bleeds. And because the battles eventually end and the killing grounds go quiet, the trees have to find their own supply. From the outside, Jubokko looks like any other tree, which is sort of the point. When a person walks too close, the branches lash out, envelop them, and send hollow tube-like growths into the body to drain the blood. It prefers children, according to some accounts, because child's blood keeps the Jubokko looking unnaturally healthy. For years, the Jubokko was assumed to be an ancient piece of Japanese folklore, kind of story passed down through the centuries of oral tradition. Then, researchers found a 1966 article by a writer named Mohiriho Sato that predates the most widely cited modern account and traced the legend to a much smaller, more localized body of storytelling than the ancient tradition is seen to represent. The yokoi artist Shigeru Mizuki, whose encyclopedic illustrated catalogs of Japanese supernatural creatures reached an enormous 20th century audience, is credited with bringing the Jubokko into mainstream awareness, and for a long time was thought to have invented it entirely. Also, if you're still here 4 plants in, you're exactly the kind of person who should subscribe. The Jinmenju, sometimes written as Jinmenju, translates from Japanese as human-faced tree and is said to bloom with flowers that look exactly like human heads. They have eyes, mouths, nose, ears, teeth. They smile constantly. And when you ask them questions, they laugh. But they don't answer because they cannot understand human language. If they laugh long enough, the flowers fall from the branches. The primary Japanese account comes from an Edo period yokai catalog called Konjaku Hayaki Shui, compiled by the artist Toriyama Seikian in the 18th century. Seikian text reads, quote, "In mountain valleys, its flowers, just like human heads without a word, they merely just smile away until its petals fall just like that." Seikian was working from an earlier Japanese encyclopedia called the Wakon Sansei Zoe, which itself is a paraphrase of a Chinese encyclopedia from 1609 called the Sansai Tuhui. The Chinese text placed the tree in a land called Daishi Koku, meaning Big Eat Country, located somewhere to the southwest, 1,000 li away, a Chinese measure of distance that's about half a kilometer or a third of a mile. So this meant roughly 500 kilometers or 310 miles. But the tree does not start in China either. The earliest written record of it appears in a Chinese source from before 801 BCE, based on a story told to a Chinese envoy by an Arab sailor whose father had spent 11 years as a prisoner of war in Baghdad. The Arabic version of the story called this the waqwa tree, and its women-faced fruit could speak and cry out before falling. By the time that Jinmenju appeared in Seikian's catalog, the legend had traveled from the Arabian Peninsula through Persia, China, and into Japan, picking up new details at every stop. What the legend lost in transit is the darkness. The Arabian version carried an explicit menace, women suspended by their hair from branches, calling out and then dying. Meanwhile, the Japanese version is uncanny rather than horrifying. The faces are placid, happy to see you. They simply cannot tell you anything useful, and if you make them laugh too hard, they drop dead. There's a version of this story recorded in a Japanese collection of strange tales from the Aizu region, in which a doctor walking through a forest valley hears whispers coming from the trees. When he approaches, the fruit turns towards him. Each one has a face, and they speak to him in one voice, a child's voice, with a child's seriousness, saying, "We are the tree." The doctor, sensibly, left. The Nariphon comes from the Pali word Naripala, meaning woman fruit. It's a tree from Thai Buddhist mythology that grows in the Himavanta forest, a mythical wilderness at the base of Mount Meru, said to be populated with creatures that exist nowhere else in the world, including the Nariphon. The Nariphon appears in 14th century Thai cosmological text, the Tripum Praruang, the oldest surviving Thai Buddhist literature, written by the philosopher king Payalitai of Sukhothai. It places the trees within a detailed account of 3 worlds of Buddhist cosmology, but its origin story is detailed in the Vesantara Jataka, one of the canonical Buddhist birth records of the Bodhisattva. In the story, the god Indra had created a forest pavilion for the prince Vasantara, the Buddha in a previous life, along with his wife Mati and their children. Every day, Mati walked into the forest to gather food, and every day she passed through territory occupied by Rusi, ascetic hermits who had spent years in deep meditation acquiring supernatural powers. The problem was that their meditation had not conquered lust, and Mati was in danger every time she left the pavilion. So, Indra planted a grove of Nariphon trees whose fruit was shaped like young women. When the hermits encountered the fruit women, they took them back to their dwellings, slept with them, and lost their powers entirely. They would then sleep for 4 months afterward while Mati walked safely through the forest. After Vesantara and his family died, the trees kept bearing fruit. And according to Thai folklore, they fruit daily and will continue to do so until the teachings of the Buddha are lost from the world, predicted to be 5,000 years after his death, around the year 5483 or 5486. These fruit women existed specifically as a trap, beautiful, passive, and designed to drain whoever touched them of whatever power they had. Any man who plucked a Nariphon lost his magical abilities permanently, or if he had none, became sterile. Women, however, were entirely immune to the effects. If a woman waited for the fruit to fall naturally after 7 days, it functioned as a fertility talisman. Alleged dried Nariphon pods are sold now as fertility amulets throughout Thailand, but there are said to be 2 genuine pods in a Buddhist temple near Bangkok. Like the Jinmenju, the Nariphon was never presented as a natural phenomenon to be investigated or debunked. It exists entirely within a cosmological system of its own internal logic. A system in which the trees serve as a specific theological function, demonstrating both Indra's protective power and the danger of unmastered desire. The hermits who were undone by the Nariphon were not innocent victims, but men who had spent years cultivating spiritual discipline only to fail the one test that mattered. The tree just happened to be the exam. Yggdrasil is an enormous ash tree at the center of Norse cosmology. Its name is a blend of words. Ygr is one of Odin's names, meaning the terrible one, and Drasil means horse. So Yggdrasil translates literally to Odin's horse, which makes no sense until you understand kenning, which is like an Old Norse poetic device or figure of speech. It basically describes something by what it does or what it resembles. For example, in Old Norse poetry, the sea is the whale road, gold is fire of the sea, sword is a wound snake, and gallows, structure man hangs from, is a horse for the hanged. There are 2 primary sources for the story of Yggdrasil. The first is the Poetic Edda, a collection of Old Norse poems, many of which predate the Viking Age. There are 3 poems in the Edda that discuss Yggdrasil. The first is the Valuspa, the vision of the seeress. Quote, "An ash I know there stands, Yggdrasil is its name, a tall tree showered with shining loam. From there come the dews that drop in the valleys. It stands for evergreen over Urdur's well." The same poem describes its doomed fate at Ragnarok, a time when the world ends and is reborn. Quote, "Yggdrasil shivers, the ash, as it stands." The old tree groans and the giant slips free. The next one, Havamal, meaning words of the High One, is where Odin describes his own sacrifice in the first person. Quote, I know that I hung on a windy tree, 9 long nights, wounded with a spear, dedicated to Odin, myself to myself, on that tree of which no man knows from where its roots run. No bread did they give me, nor a drink from a horn. Downwards I peered. I took up the runes, screaming, I took them. Then I fell back from there. Taking this a little bit further, the parallels with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ are hard to ignore. The spear wound, the self-sacrifice. Scholars have debated for centuries whether similarities are just a coincidence, a story yoinked from older religions to make conversion to Christianity easier, or something older that both traditions drew on. Finally, in the Grimnasmal, Odin, disguised as a prisoner, delivers a full cosmological account to a young man named Agnar. The first mention isn't incredibly descriptive. It just says that Odin tells Thor he must wade through 4 rivers to sit as judge at the ash of Yggdrasil. Then it gives a list of horses the gods will ride to sit as judges as well. The second mention is where Odin gives us a more detailed description of the tree. He describes the tree's 3 roots, each growing in a different direction and housing a different world. Beneath the first lives Hel, the realm of the dead. Beneath the second live the frost giants. Beneath the third lives humanity. Odin then describes what lives on the tree. Ratatoskar is a squirrel who runs up and down its length, carrying messages between the eagle at the top and the Nidhagar at the roots. 4 stags, Dane, Dvalin, Dunair, and Dorathor, consume the highest boughs. And beneath the roots, Odin says, lie more serpents than any fool can imagine. Among them Ofnir, the winding one, and Safnir, the one who puts to sleep, which is to say death. He believes they will gnaw on the branches forever. Finally, Odin tells us the tree's fate. Yggdrasil suffers agony more than men know. A heart bites it from above, it decays on its sides, and Nidhagar bites it from beneath. And in stanza 44, when Odin lists the noblest things of all kind in your creation, he names Yggdrasil first. It is both the noblest of trees and the one being eaten alive from every direction, which is kind of a trippy metaphor for the world, don't you think? The second source, I know, it's a lot, is the Prose Edda, written around 1220 by the fantastically named Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson, roughly 200 years after Iceland converted to Christianity. Sturluson was trying to preserve the mythological knowledge that underpinned Old Norse poetry before it was lost entirely. The tree appears primarily in a section called Gylfaginning, the tricking of Gylfi, structures a dialogue between a disguised king named Gengleri and 3 mysterious figures called High, Just as High, and Third. When Gengleri asks where the holiest place of the gods is, High answers immediately, it is the ash Yggdrasil. There the gods must hold their court each day. When Gengleri asks what there is to tell about it, Just as High says it is the biggest and best of all trees, that its branches extend over the world and reach into the sky, and that 3 roots support it, each extending extremely far. One among the gods, one among the forest giants, and one over Niflheim, the realm of the dead. The root over Niflheim is gnawed by the dragon Nidhogr. Beneath the root reaching the frost giants lies the well of Mimir, which contains, in Sturluson's words, wisdom and intelligence, and is where Odin sacrifices his eye to drink from it. Beneath the third root lies the holy well, Udarbrunnr, where the gods ride each day across the bridge Bifrost to hold court. In chapter 16, High describes the tree's inhabitants. An eagle of vast knowledge sits in the branches with the hawk Vildfornir perched between its eyes. Ratatoskar the squirrel carries what Sturluson calls malicious messages between the eagle and Nidhagar, deliberately stirring conflict between them. 4 stags consume the foliage. At the roots runs a spring called Hvergelmir, where there are so many serpents alongside Nidhagar that High says, quote, no tongue can enumerate them. Sturluson then shares a detail which doesn't appear in the Poetic Edda. The tree also houses the Norns, the 3 beings who weave fate, named Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld. The Norns take water from their well every day and pour it over Yggdrasil, along with the mud around it to prevent the branches from rotting and keep the world tree alive. High adds that the dew falling from Yggdrasil to the earth is what people call honeydew, and that bees feed from it. High says Yggdrasil is doomed. At Ragnarok, the end of the world, the tree will shake. Nidhagar will finally succeed. the world held in its branches will fall, and nothing in heaven or earth will be unafraid. What separates Yggdrasil from the other plants in this episode is the scale. Yggdrasil is the architecture of existence itself, and it is alive, suffering, and losing. Every plant on this list so far has some negativity to it. The vegetable lamb confuses you, the Ya-te-veo ate you, Upas poisoned everything within 15 miles, Jubokko drained your blood, even Yggdrasil, the most noblest of all trees, is being eaten alive. So let's do a palate cleanser now and talk about the fern flower, which just wants to give you things. The fern flower appears across Baltic and Slavic mythology under different names in nearly every language of the region. According to Slavic folklore, ferns bloom exactly once a year and only for a moment, at midnight on the night of Ivan Kupala, the midsummer festival celebrated across Russia, Ukraine, Poland, and Belarus on the eve of St. John's Day. But the festival of Ivan Kupala itself is older than the flower legend. It's documented in early Russian chronicles as a midsummer celebration of wine, fire, fertility, and the boundary between the human and spirit worlds. Young men and women would jump over bonfires together. If they cleared the flames without letting go of each other's hands, they were considered destined for marriage. Flower crowns were floated on rivers to divine the identity of future spouses. The phrase searching for the fern flower became common shorthand for couples slipping away into the forest together, with the flower as a socially acceptable pretext for something else entirely. During this time when the fern flower blooms, it's said that it glows red, gold, or purple, depending on the tradition, with its own inner light. And whoever finds it and keeps it receives the ability to become clairvoyant, understand the language of animals, see all treasures buried in the earth, no matter how deep, open any lock by holding the flower to it, command unclean spirits, wield earth and water, become invisible, and take the form of anything they choose. Which all sounds pretty great. Sort of like answering, all of the above to what superpower would you want to have. But there's a small problem. Ferns are among the oldest plant families on the earth and reproduce by spores. They have never produced a flower in approximately 360 million years of existence. The Slavic tradition knew this, and that was kind of the point. The legend says that it blooms precisely because it cannot bloom. The one moment it does is the one moment where the world briefly turns upside down, and anyone brave enough to be in the forest at midnight can reach for it. Now, I say brave enough because Ivan Kupala night is also the night when demons, spirits, and witches are at their most powerful. The same magic that causes the fern to bloom gives them the strength as well. The seeker must find the fern in a secluded part of the forest, draw a protective circle around its base, and climb toward the flower as demons surround them, deafening, numerous, doing everything possible to make the seeker look away, because if they look away before the bloom reveals itself, they will die. But the seekers aren't helpless and will cover themselves in mugwort, an herb associated with protection, to ward off the spirits. In Christian-era versions of the story, a rosary replaces the mugwort. Some traditions add that the wealth gained from the flower cannot be shared, and telling anyone about it causes all the money and powers to vanish immediately. While other traditions say the flower can be presented by hiding a petal under the tongue, in the shoe, or in a wound cut into the hand. Botanists and ethnographers have suggested that the legend may have originated from a custom where women smear themselves with adder's tongue fern leaves during the festival, which was believed to increase their attractiveness. A fern associated with desire, with one night a year when the rules loosen, we think that what happened was someone at some point started building on that and turning it into a legend where anything is possible. Kalpavriksha, Sanskrit for eon tree, is the Hindu wish-fulfilling tree. It also appears in Jain cosmology and Buddhism, sometimes called the Ratnavriksha, the jeweled tree. It's the only plant in this entire episode that requires no conditions. There's no bargains, and there's no demons surrounding you in the dark. You sit beneath it, and it gives you whatever you want, for better or for worse. Its story comes from part of the Samudra Manthan, the turning of the ocean, and the story alone could fill its own episode. This short version goes like this. The gods, or devas, have been stripped of their power by a curse from the sage Durvasha, and the demons, or asuras, have taken over the heavens. Lord Vishnu advised the Devas to form a temporary alliance with the Asuras to churn the ocean of milk together, using Mount Mandraha as the churning rod and the great serpent Vasuki as the rope. Doing this will bring up Amrita, the nectar of immortality, from the deep. Vishnu took the form of a giant tortoise to prevent the mountain from sinking. From that churning rose 14 sacred treasures, and the Kalpavriksha was one of them. Indra, king of the gods, claimed it and brought it to his paradise, specifically to the peak of Mountain Meru at the center of his 5 celestial gardens. There it stood, granting every wish to those who sat beneath it, which kind of sucks for the Asuras. They aligned themselves with the Devas, did half the churning, yet received none of the tree's benefits. They lived comparatively in poverty at the lower part of the trunk and roots, while the Devas above freely received its divine flowers and fruits. The Kalpavriksha then became one of the reasons the war between the gods and demons never ends. The most famous teaching associated with the tree is a parable found across multiple Hindu traditions. A wandering man, exhausted by the heat, sits beneath a beautiful tree to rest. He thinks how nice it would be to have a glass of cold water, and one appears. Delighted, he thinks of food, and it appears. He thinks of a comfortable place to sleep. It appears. Then, inevitably, his mind wanders into fear. He thinks, what if a tiger comes? A tiger appears. What if it attacks me? It attacks. The man is killed beneath the wish-fulfilling tree by his own thought. In Hindu philosophical tradition, the Kalpavriksha is also a symbol for consciousness itself, the idea that the mind, given enough power, manifests whatever it holds. The tree itself isn't dangerous. It's your thoughts that are. In some traditions, a fragment of the original tree, leaf, twig, or root has found its way into the earth, allowing its essence to take root in the mortal world, which is why, even today, certain ancient trees in India are venerated as Kalpavrikshas. What separates the Kalpavriksha from the fern flower is that the fern flower asks you to survive for it, while the Kalpavriksha asks nothing. It simply sits there in heaven, granting wishes to gods, and according to the parable, to anyone foolish enough to think without discipline while sitting beneath it. Zaqqum appears in the Quran 4 times in Surah Al-Isra, Surah As-Safat, Surah Al-Dukhan, and Surah Al-Waqi'ah. It's the only plant in this episode that appears in a text that is understood by a tradition to be the literal direct word of God, not a God speaking within a myth like Odin and the Yggdrasil, but God speaking directly to the reader. It's a tree rooted at the bottom of hell, in the place of maximum heat where nothing should be able to grow. The Quran describes it as springing upward through the fire, its trunk rising through the layers of hell, and its branches spreading outward across it. When the Quran was first revealed, the tribe of Mecca that opposed Prophet Muhammad mocked this image openly because how can a tree grow in fire? Fire destroys trees. And Quran's response in Surah Al-Safat is essentially that this tree is not like other trees. It is the inverted mirror of every living thing. In hell, the condemned are driven to its fruit by hunger, as it's the only food available, but consuming it is another punishment in itself. The fruit, which resembles the head of devils, tears through the body and releases burning fluid. In the stomach, according to scholar Umar Suleiman al-Ashkar, it churns like boiling oil. Then, after eating, they're given boiling water to drink, just to add another level of torment and suffering. The name Zaqqum itself is believed to derive from an Arabic root meaning to force feed or to swallow with difficulty. The name of the tree is literally the act of being made to eat something you cannot bear to eat. There's also a real plant called Zaqqum in the Arabian Peninsula, a bitter thorny shrub native to the Tihama coastal region. The origins of the Zaqqum image have been traced by scholars to older traditions. The Apocryphon of John, a 2nd century Gnostic text, contains a description of a tree of darkness whose root is bitter, whose shadow is hate, and whose fruit is death. Every other tree on this list exists in the world or at the edge of it. Zaqqum grows from fire. It's not fed by light or water. It doesn't shelter anything. It does not grant wishes or hold the cosmos together or bloom for one miraculous moment in the dark. It exists entirely to be eaten and to cause suffering, and it does this eternally to anyone who arrives, without exception, forever. Every plant on this list came from the same place, a human mind trying to make sense of a world that was too large, dangerous, generous, or cruel. We've been doing this for as long as we've had language, and we will probably never stop, because my research showed that there are way more plants ready to have their stories told. So part 2 is already in the works. But if you have a mythical plant you think deserves a spot, leave it in the comments and let me know. If you want more botanical history while you wait, check out my episode about the plants featured in Witches' Flying Potions and learn why a broom isn't just a broom. Until next time, Greenies, stay curious.